With his book, Devil Take You Home. He'll be in conversation with our own Bill Boyle. That's at 5:30 Tuesday, August 9th. And then on Thursday at 4:30, a little unusual time, but there's a reason. We have Sasha Graham with The Magic of Tarot. So she's gonna talk about her book, The Magic of Tarot, and do a demonstration. So that's at 4:30, Thursday, August 11th. But tonight we're here for Tony Marra, his new book, Mercury Pictures presents. Let's see, here's the official on Tony. Tony Marra received his MFA from the Iowa's Writers Workshop and was a Stegner Fellow at Stanford. He's the author of Constellation of Vital Phenomenon, which won the National Book Critics inaugural John Leonard Prize and the Aristeld Wolf Book Award in fiction. Among many other accolades. And his second book, The Czar of Love and Techno, a collection of linked stories, was a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist for fiction. He's a native of DC and lives in Connecticut. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our publishing partner, Hogarth, and especially Marnie Folkman, who helped put this thing together for us. So please help me welcome Tony Marra to Square Books.
Thank you so much.
No.
Thank you so much. There we go. Thank you so much for coming out on a hot August evening, and thank you so much for inviting me and being in conversation. Thank you to Square Books. This is such a treat. So my first book, A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, was published. This was one of the very first places that I did a reading, and so. Being able to come back here, it feels like a sense of homecoming in a way, and I'm just thrilled to be here. So thank you.
Yeah, we were laughing. We're both still getting a little pepper, but we're grayer these days.
Yeah,
more salt.
Yeah, much more salt. It's really, I mean, more by the day. It's just dismaying.
Well, it's so great to have you. And I love the book. Loved all your books, of course. This one's. In a way, your other ones were set in Chechnya and then in the USSR. And so this one, I got it, it's set in Italy and 1940s pre-war and World War II Hollywood. So I was like, Tony's changing geopolitical locations on us.
But I was ready to come in from the cold after 2 books set in Russia. Yeah, it's funny. My wife, Kathy, after my second book came out, she sat me down and said, Tony, I would really appreciate it if you would write something where you can go on a research trip that I would actually want to join you on. So I got my marching orders and I did my best to fulfill them.
Well, it was just as fabulous as the other ones. You had some line when we were doing this sort of pre-pub virtual thing. It was Siberia West, is what you called like?
Sunny Siberia,
Sunny
yeah.
Siberia.
So Sunny Siberia is what a number of, so I should probably, maybe I'll give the little elevator pitch. Yeah, so Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect, once said of Los Angeles that if you tip the world on its side, all the loose pieces will land in LA. And this was never more true than it was in the 1930s and 40s when thousands and thousands of émigrés fleeing the war in Europe landed in LA, and many of them ended up going to work in Hollywood. And some of them you might be familiar with, Hedy Lamarr or Billy Wilder, but there were a number who worked and lived sort of on the margins of Hollywood. You had internationally renowned playwrights like Bertolt Brecht who were struggling to churn out B-movie pot boilers. You had German Jewish actors who, because of their accents, could only find work portraying the very Nazis they thought they had escaped. And so that community sort of forms the basis of this book. I was really interested particularly in how these individuals survived and thrived in some cases during the war when many of them were classified as enemy aliens and denied the very rights that their movies championed. and we sort of, our entry point into all of this is this studio named Mercury Pictures, which is this sort of rundown B-movie factory in which a character named Maria Lagana works. And so, what were we talking about before this?
Well,
I lost.
Sunny Siberia.
Sunny Siberia.
yeah, we were just giving the quick pitch, but
Yeah, yeah.
you started off with Sunny Siberia.
So many of these émigrés refer to LA as Sunny Siberia, and I became fascinated with this idea of this sort of picturesque, beautiful place that nonetheless to its inhabitants, in this case these very erudite émigrés from Europe, feels like this wasteland, and what it would be like to live in a sunny Siberia.
Yeah, and so let's talk about one of the great things about all your books is that there's a central character, say like Maria Lagana, who's comes from a refugee from Mussolini's Italy with her mother, and then you have the cast of characters that orbit around her, and there's multiple stories threads, and they all go back and forth in time. So how do you, was Maria your entry point? I know you have this idea of Hollywood, but where did you start?
Yeah. So Maria Lagana is sort of the focal point for the novel. She is this sort of up-and-coming producer who works under this head of production named Artie Feldman, who is the type of guy who keeps his toupees on the shelf where a more successful producer would keep his Oscars. And Maria, I was drawn to her in part because I love screwball comedies, and the screwball comedies of that era featured characters a lot like Maria. She's this very tough-minded, irreverent striver who's sort of constantly confronting the idiocy of the world around her. And I sort of imagined her as a version of Rosalind Russell's character in His Girl Friday, only a bit more salty and a lot more Italian. And she arrived to LA after fleeing Italy with her mother, and they left in part because of her father was arrested for something that Maria herself was responsible for. And so even though she's sort of transformed herself into this unflappable producer, she is sort of haunted by the role she played in her father's fate. And I was really interested in sort of as you said, how the book has a lot of different characters, and they sort of all revolve around Maria's life in one way or another. But she was sort of the first character who opened the door for me and led me into this particular world.
So did you, because it was a book about a film studio, as you said, I could sense that screwball comedy, particularly the dialogue was so great between Artie, her boss, and Maria is like, exactly like one of those great classic black and white Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy movies. And then when you switch to another storyline, which is Giuseppe, who's Maria's father, and his attempt to escape this San Lorenzo, this sort of concentration camp or camp where he's been sent by the Mussolini's people. There's almost a noir quality to it. So did you watch a lot of films, and did you sort of figure out different dialogue and sort of moods for each of those sections with the films?
Yeah, so one of the great things about writing a book set in this period is you can sit around all day in your pajamas watching old movies and call it work. So that could be why this took me about 8 years to write. I kind of love the idea of writing a book that really tried to draw in the various tropes and language and sort of world building of some of the movies at the time. So there is in the office place of Maria's film studio, there is this sort of screwball comedy atmosphere, and then we switch to in certain sections we switch back to Italy to sort of follow the fate of Maria's father. And one of the sort of peculiar things about Italy at this time is if you were a dissident or you had fallen afoul of Mussolini and the fascist party in some ways, you were sentenced to internal exile. So you were essentially just shipped to southern Italy, and you would be sent to a little town, and there was no barbed wire, there were no walls to this prison. You were just in a little town, and that was kind of how much people didn't want to live in southern Italy at the time. That simply living there was considered a suitable punishment for treachery, for lack of a better term. So in those sections, I was trying to sort of draw from some of the classic noir, particularly around there's this sort of prison escape, I love the idea of sort of like paying homage to the movies that meant so much to me. So I wrote a lot of this book, even though it took me a number of years. Most of it was actually written during the pandemic, and in part it was because Cappy, my partner, and I were watching a ton of movies at the time, and so like this book almost became a way of funneling all of those experiences into one place. I think that one of the most beautiful things about both cinema and fiction is that it allows you, it gives you access to places you can't otherwise visit. It allows you access to individuals you'll never otherwise meet. And during quarantine and during the lockdown, that sense of like wanting to feel transported somewhere, anywhere outside of your one-bedroom apartment became acute. So I was trying to sort of create on the page the kinds of experiences that I was seeking in my own life at the time.
Well, you did it well. Definitely transports you. Well, let's talk about research to some degree. I know you had a background in some kind of political science, right? Or you went to school over and did some time over from USC over in Eastern Europe, and
I did some time in Eastern Europe.
Yeah. That's why you had to switch to Italy right now. But there was this. I know you must do a ton of research. How do you decide what to sort of, are there favorite parts that can't get in, and how does the story just dictate what gets in, and then also like Anna Weber, is that Weber? She's like this. She's a miniaturist and works on film sets and worked for the Nazi propaganda machine, and then she's one of the émigrés that comes to Mercury Pictures, but they build this for the army, right? This huge sort of German town, to see how the bombs would go through it, and I assume that's true, and it must have been kind of fascinating to come across all these little facets like that.
Yeah, I feel like research is really kind of one of the great joys of writing. It gives you an excuse to become, an amateur expert on a particular topic for a couple of years. And there's always this give and take between what you can put in and what, for your own kind of interest and what you need to leave on the cutting room floor in terms of what the story dictates. So, for instance, I had this entire chapter that didn't make it into the final version of the book, set on the set of Casablanca, which was absolutely bonkers. So Peter Lorre, the émigré actor, who I can't remember the name of the character he plays. He's the guy who has the transit papers in the beginning of Casablanca, and he is killed, and Humphrey Bogart comes into possession of them. But he was this practical jokester, and he was, it seemed like he more or less took this part to work on this film in order to terrorize the director. So the director, Michael Curtiz, he was always smoking cigarettes, and Peter Lorre had this little eyedropper, and every time Michael Curtiz put his cigarette down in the ashtray tray, Peter Lorre would come over with his eyedropper and just put it out. And over time, Michael Curtiz was gradually growing crazier and crazier. And He did stuff like, I guess Michael Curtiz's girlfriend would come to the set to be with Michael Curtiz in the afternoons on certain days, and Peter Lorre decided to pay the sound engineers to broadcast their liaisons to the entire soundstage. And Curtiz, comes out totally unaware of any of this afterwards. And so like, this was just these stories of Casablanca were so fascinating, and I wrote this entire sort of slapstick scene with Peter Lorre, and it ended up just not really furthering the plot at all, and it had to go. So that would be an example of research that was just like really interesting and strange and particular that didn't make it into the final version. Whereas what you just mentioned, German Village, is an example of something that did. So in the 1940s, the U.S. Army contracted a number of people from the film industry to come to Utah to help build a life-size Berlin neighborhood, and this was one of the more sort of bizarre little factoids that I came across during my research for this book. The purpose of this was to try to create this sort of molecularly accurate version of a Berlin neighborhood. So they had all the furniture was made by German POWs, or was purchased from German Americans in New York. All of the floorboards were shipped overseas from Russia, because Russian tenements used a similar kind of timber as what you would find in a Berlin tenement. At night, firemen came around and they hosed down these tenements, not because they were trying to put out any fires, but because they wanted to ensure that the humidity level of the wood frames was accurate to that of Berlin. So why go to this, insane amount of trouble and effort and cost and labor in order to create this accurate Berlin neighborhood? It was, as you said, because they were trying to figure out how to best bomb Berlin, how to start a firestorm. And one of the sort of fascinating aspects of it is that so many of the people who were involved were these German émigrés, who themselves were often deeply homesick. And it's obviously understandable why they would dedicate themselves to this task, given the stakes of the war. But at the same time, there seems something so emotionally just paradoxical and interesting about the idea of these émigrés who are building a Berlin in the middle of Utah that they're able to return to briefly, but the price of that is to abet the real Berlin's destruction.
Let's see. Last question, and then we'll open it up to all y'all in case you might have some questions. A lot of when Maria moves to Los Angeles with her mother, they live with all their other 3 aunts, and there's all this. They have a restaurant. So with you being Italian, were there some stuff from your family's, like some recipes, or just some of the stuff you remember from growing up, like any kind of family stuff in there?
Yeah. So Maria has these 3 aunts. They're named Lala, Mimi, and Pep, and they're actually based on my own great aunts.
And they are hilarious.
They are.
What's their theory of marriage? Like, you just get it over with, so
yeah, it's
the husband will die, and then you can...
A venereal condition of the heart.
Yeah.
That best to get it over with while you're young enough to bounce back. Her great aunts are based on my own great aunts. I had these. So my grandfather and my great aunts, they came from a family of 9 kids, and each one of them, half of them died in childhood. and their names just got passed down. So my grandfather was named Anthony, but he just received his name after his older brother died. And so of all my great aunts, only one of them was the first person among her siblings to receive her name. That everybody else just sort of, got these hand-me-down names. And so coming from, a time and a place where, where half of your siblings pass away, 3 of my great aunts lived into their late 90s, and they hated every single second of it. They were very fatalistic and very dour, and I really tried to convey that through Maria's experiences. One of Maria's great aunts, when she's a girl, looks at her and says, "You poor, poor girl, you have your whole life ahead of you." And that was, something very much in tune with my own great aunts. And maybe I'll just finish by telling a story about my great aunt Mimi and bookstores. So when she was 96 when my first book came out. She came to my first reading that I did in Washington D.C. at Politics and Prose, and she went around and told every single person in the audience that this place is a fire trap. Do you see all of these books? One spark is all it will take, and it'll go up in flames. We'll die. At the same time, though, she could be really sort of secretly very sweet. And this is also what I was trying to convey with Maria's relationships with her great aunt. So Mimi, her driver's license expired about 15 years earlier. But she decided that she would ride again when Constellation was published, and she took the Cadillac out of the garage, and she drove around to every bookstore in New Jersey that she could find, and she would take my books from the back, and she'd move them to the front, and then she would take all of James Patterson's books from the front, and move those to the back. And so in some bookshops in central New Jersey, I was briefly selling better than James Patterson.
That's great. I love it. Well, does anybody have any questions for Tony? Bill?
Well, on the subject of relatives, were any of your relatives caught up in the resident alien restrictions?
They weren't. So
Wait, can you repeat the question?
the question is whether any of my relatives were caught up in the enemy alien restrictions. So in California, if you were a citizen of an Axis country, you were classified as an enemy alien, and you were restricted to only traveling within 5 miles of your house. You had to give up any radios or cameras or flashlights that you might happen to have. If you couldn't work in any industry that was tangentially related to defense. If you lived on the coastline, you had to move inland. And one of the things that was really kind of sort of quite twisted and tragic about the experience of many of these enemy aliens is that they themselves had fled persecution in Europe, and they arrive in California thinking that they finally found a place where they can be free and prosper, only to be regarded as the citizens and people of the very country that had kicked them out. And so Maria and some of the other characters at this film studio are face some of those restrictions. But it was really primarily only on the West Coast where Italian and German citizens encountered that. On the East Coast, that wasn't the case. In part, it was just because there were too many Italians in New York and Boston for those restrictions even to make sense, and there were too much of a political force in those states. And it was also just a matter of the fact that California and Oregon and Washington were considered part of the front line in a way, like technically as a matter of like so my relatives were all in Brooklyn, so they didn't face that at all.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Well, I know we're never supposed to say don't judge a book by its cover, but your cover is a beautiful cover. And I'm just kind of curious, were you given any creative allowance on it, or did your publisher provide someone and they went with it and it turned out, you know, to be a nice looking cover?
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So do you want to tell them about the original cover?
It wasn't the best. No, whenever somebody reached out to me just because I love Tony's work and was like, you know, reaching out to different big stuff. What do you think about it? But it just didn't have it. It was just kind of very commercial looking and kind of said nothing. And I was actually telling Tony how much I like this cover, and then he has the.
So between the first cover that Cody saw and this cover, there were 150 other covers.
Oh my God.
So yeah, it took us a while to land on one, but when my editor finally sent this one over, you know, his email was, you know, this is the one, and sure enough it was. Yeah, it's tough. Like I think that that it can be really difficult to you know, summarize or convey, you know, a 300 or 400 page book just with a single image. And so I think oftentimes, you know, jacket designers tend to reach for what's worked in the past, but for obvious reasons that can sometimes result in covers that feel a bit bland or you know, or cliche. So yeah, I was very pleased with this.
That's very sure.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Lisa.
Seen the acknowledgments, a million books that you read, consulted anyway to do this, but I'm wondering if you had to name your top 3 books about the history of filmmaking at this period, what would they be?
Yeah, so my top 3 would be City of Nets by Otto Friedrich, which was published in the 70s, and it is this absolutely just glorious take on the decade in Hollywood. He is able to sort of just cherry pick the most interesting, most funny. Like it's one of those books where you know, it's very long and the print is very small, but it's just such a joy to read. Like you're laughing on every page, and he just has an eye for the absurd that I really appreciated. Another author, another book that was fantastic is called Hollywood: The Dream Factory, and it is by the wonderfully named Hortense Powdermaker. And she was an anthropologist, and she had done, I believe she had done like work in Papua New Guinea, and I think she did work in the South as well. And at some point, she decided that she wanted to do an anthropological study of Hollywood, and so she treats it as if it is this this distant civilization that she's encountering for the first time, which in many respects it is, and it is it's just really very interesting, particularly because she at various times like is framing it in terms of her research in Papua New Guinea and just sort of how certain power structures and how certain taboos and dreads and desires, how they sort of are manifest themselves in these different ways, in these different very different societies, and yet how sort of enduring certain aspects of power and taboo and desire are, and she sort of surveys, I don't know, several hundred people in Hollywood, and she gave them all blanket confidentiality, and so people kind of dish to her in a way that they might not otherwise, and just like the little just little nuggets that she's able to extract, and often it's in cases where the interview subject doesn't really quite realize what he or she is revealing. She interviews this producer who is saying how his son, how his son's teachers say that he's not good enough to go to Harvard, and how he insists that he's going to buy his son more brains. And it's just this whole riff on how he literally wants to buy his kid more brains. And it just gives you a wonderful insight into maybe less like the less Hollywood as like a hub of film than Hollywood as sort of a center for very neurotic people.
I think that's only two, right?
Oh, two.
Yeah.
Maybe the last one would be Five Came Back by Mark Harris, which
What
is
is this again?
Five Came Back. It's that's the only one of those three that's been written this century. It's by Mark Harris. He is a film sort of a film scholar. It was turned into a Netflix documentary a couple years ago, and he looks at 5 filmmakers who joined up with the army. Frank Capra, John Huston, William Wyler, John Gordon, one other, whom I can't recall. And he just sort of tracks their journey as they go into the field, with their cameras as they're sort of transported from Hollywood sound stages to the trenches. And it's just a really colorful and interesting look at, sort of how propaganda films were made in that period, and particularly how they were in many times staged. John Huston, would he at one point for his most famous film during this period, he went to a battle as it was ending, and then spent the next 2 months restaging the battle. It was at this tiny town in Italy, and they started shooting up the ruins again, and he was literally directing this battle, and little moments like that I feel like were important to how I conceived of various points in the book.
Last attempt for question. All right, you.
I was just gonna ask, did Kathy get to go to Italy on a research trip?
She did. We went on 2.
Oh, awesome, good.
Yeah.
And did you have one, sir? Okay. All right. Well, Tony, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And we've got copies for sale front. Tony will be glad to sign them. Tell all your friends, web world, buy this from us, signed. And you can view this on our YouTube channel. But really, we just appreciate you coming, Tony. And
Yeah.
thank you all for coming out tonight. Let's give a hand to Tony Marra.